Do you have a profound sense of importance? How about a strong will? Do you feel inferior at any time? Do you think that that's something hiding in the background? How about self-confidence? Do you feel like you have a realistic outlook despite your situation? Is it real? And is it realistic? These are some things we're going to cover in this episode of optimism versus pessimism. Check us out. Here's a short intro. And ironically, the name of this tune is The Bright Side. So maybe it's a prelude to what we're going to come up with as an outcome. Maybe not. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, we'll be right back. All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening to the Mind Out podcast. We're going to dig right in and get into some of the psychoanalytic literature. A little Schopenhauer. That was kind of a commercial I had on the Facebook page. I was mainly making fun of his hair, but he's a noted philosopher with what a lot of people would consider as a huge pessimistic outlook on basically most things. Some of my friends that I have discussed Schopenhauer with or lent a book to, you know who you are, has really looked at it and seen some depression in this guy. And I'm not going to go into his background, but even if you look on Wikipedia, you can see what kind of a rough time he had growing up. Anyway, it's reflective in his philosophy, but Schopenhauer is one of the greats. He's still remembered today, which that should tell you something. And it's not because of the hairdo. All right, maybe some of it's the hairdo. But anyway, what I have as one of his books is the Essential Schopenhauer. So it's kind of a key selections from a few of his writings. It's a good compilation. If you get a chance, check it out. You really have to kind of go deep with this guy. So I would take him with a grain of salt. And you might find out that he's really got some profound things to say about life and the will. And he even gets into music, and a lot of different topics. So check him out if you get a chance. Don't hate me if you don't like it, but like I said, take him with a grain of salt. As he discussed the will, he basically said that the will appears in everything, as it determines itself within itself and outside of time, and that the world is a mirror of this willing and all finiteness, and all suffering and misery that it contains belong to the expression of what the will wills itself to do. He goes on to say that that the will so wills these things to happen, basically. But one of the quotes that I can pull out of his writing that I thought was very thought-provoking was when he said that if we could lay all the misery of the world in one pan of the scales and all the guilt in the other, the pointer would certainly show them to be in equilibrium. I think that that's pretty profound, even though he's a, kind of a mostly pessimistic thinker. He's got some things to say while he's down there. And that kind of leads into our discussion today, that pessimism is kind of an answer to a lot of the anxiety that goes on into someone's outlook. I think that we might find people that have more kind of readily available, if you want to say, anxiety, that someone could be more attuned to having a more pessimistic kind of outlook on not everything. I don't want to say like this is blanket, like everything is just pessimistic with people. We know some Debbie Downers, no doubt about that. You're not going to get around that, but as kind of a structure in the mind, pessimism can kind of manifest itself into situational circumstances. And it can actually end up being kind of helpful. We have times when we need to prepare for things, and you might think about worst case scenarios. So if I'm going to give a lecture, or I'm going to get up and sing in front of people, which I'm totally not. But if you do, thinking about, I'm just going to go out there and, blow the roof off the place and not really plan ahead for things that could go wrong. I think you're setting yourself up. It's almost kind of like having a toolkit in the trunk of your car, that like you're not like gonna kind of will your way into your car working the way it's supposed to all the time. Cars don't come out with spare tires because we have this optimistic outlook that we're never going to run over a nail, because it could happen. Doesn't mean it's going to all the time, but it pays to be prepared. So we have these strategies to avoid having those bad things to happen. But on the flip side, so if you want to look at an optimistic side, is maybe an approach or mindset that allows you to be able to compensate when something bad does happen. You know, that you're not going to get pulled down or sucked in to the gravity of all the negativity of the thing that happened to you or around you or somebody with you, because hope is a good motivator. If you've read any of Viktor Frankl's writings, you probably had noticed that he was a concentration camp survivor who went through the Holocaust, and he said that basically they can take everything from me when he was in this prison camp, but I can still look out my window and I can still watch the sunrise every day, and the thing that they can't take from me is my attitude I have toward my existence. And I think that that's also profound, that despite all the negative circumstances and all of everything that happened to him and others like him, that he could still have that positive outlook in the midst of the tragedy of the Holocaust. But what I would not suggest is to try and force positivity or force an optimism that's maybe not genuine. So it gets kind of tricky in that regard. So the positivity or the optimism that I'm talking about is pretty much anything if you're going to have to force yourself. So let's unpack this for a minute. So happiness is more of a byproduct of experiences and things that we do in our life. So if you're not having a good time and somebody says to you, well, just be happy. You know, yeah, if I'd only thought about that, thank you for curing, no, it can't happen. And in fact, I've talked to waiters and waitresses who say how exhausting it is to be able to put on this fake happiness when they come, because they're working hard, they've been on their feet all day, they're carrying heavy trays, and they still have to come to your table and pretend, I'm in the best mood of my life, how can I serve you today? That's going through that is very exhausting, having to fake that. And I could imagine, I've never done it myself, but talking to people that have been in those situations, it's true, even like a tour guide or something like that. You got people who have paid a lot of money because they want to go on this tour, whatever it is, and they've got to be spunky and they've got to be spontaneous and they've got to be bubbly. And I think that's the expectation, that we want to be entertained in a way. But at the same time, you don't want to be ordering a $25 steak and having Debbie Downer come to your table and take your order either, because it kind of reflects bad on the establishment, and I don't know if that's realistic. I don't think it's realistic at all. The next time you go and sit down at a restaurant, no matter how much you pay for your food, maybe think about that. Is what the establishment, it makes it sound like government, but the establishment or maybe the restaurant is trying to promote this these optics that you come here and everybody's happy and it's a wonderful place. It's the atmosphere. And I think that, we could go down the rabbit hole here and talk about employment and all that, but But coming back to it, you pay that kind of money for food. You don't want Debbie Downer from Saturday Night Live coming to your table and moping all around your family and dragging everybody down because you're trying to have a good time because, maybe you kind of feel that way and you want to get out and get out of your head and go eat a nice meal. So there's times where, those people get exhausted from doing that. And I can totally relate with that. But to get into some of the psychoanalytic literature, some of the psychoanalytic research reflects that some of the writings we're calling optimism, haughtiness, which is maybe kind of an old term, but that certain traits of optimism are from an anxious sense of inferiority. I asked some of the questions at the beginning of the podcast, but leading back, maybe some of this is inferred by the persona that we have to put this on, or maybe there's part of us that really feels like if we can believe the optimism, then nothing can drag us down. But there's an uncertainty that kind of this enthusiast has to puff up his truths that he maybe feels not very sure about. Although whenever somebody is optimistic like this, you tend to gain maybe a following. If somebody's a noted kind of like, optimistic person, and that there's value and trustworthiness in these person's convictions. But underneath that, what the literature is saying is that there's a secret fear of being left alone. That he's convincing himself and other people of his opinions. And when he does, he feels safe from these gnawing doubts and this isolation. That, optimistic self-confidence conceals a profound sense of impotence, for which the person's conscious optimism acts as an unsuccessful compensation for, you could call it an unconscious deficit that may be going on in the background. And I think, with the unconscious, that's things that we have no clue are underneath the mechanisms for, how we're going about our daily life. And if you think about Freud, another psychoanalyst, I'm sure a lot of people have seen the iceberg example that he had, that when it's in the water, you can see the tip of the iceberg, but underneath that, there's an enormous mass under the surface that nobody can see anything about. Just like the Titanic's, famous run-in with the one that they hit. So a little bit on the unconscious, but I'll go into Goethe with Faust, Johann, that in one of his most, well, if not the opus of his work, that there was a section in there that I thought was interesting, and it goes like this: just follow the old advice of my cousin the snake. There'll come a time when your godliness will make you quiver and quake. And I think what he's saying there is that if, there's a person that's got this put on of, of these behaviors or this sense of self that's on a pedestal. That something can happen to that, and will happen to that, if we're unaware of what's going on. And that's where the unconscious kind of comes back in. Now, I really feel like there's a continuum between optimism and pessimism, and you could have a leaning to too far to one side or too far to the other side. Now, I think if you are too far to the optimistic side, you can kind of cling on to a delusional aspect, of a delusional mindset, by always saying or thinking things are going to always get better. Things are always going to get better. And I think that what that does is set you up for an unrealistic, exaggerated expectation, or maybe even an underestimation of difficulties. And we've talked a little bit about delusions in a previous podcast, and I feel that it's relevant to this topic as well, because it gets into the same territory. Being extraordinarily optimistic can be delusional in a way, because it might be kind of not a pathological break from reality, but it can be, it can be unrealistic. So, to shift gears a little bit here and maybe continue talking about this continuum, I came across a story about a tribe of Africans on Mount Elgon, and I'll read it to you. This is out of one of Carl Jung's writings, out of Psychology and Religion of the West. He says, I had occasion to observe this original oneness of the Father world when I was with a tribe of Africans on Mount Elgon. These people professed to believe that the Creator had made everything good and beautiful. But what about the bad animals that kill your cattle? I asked. They replied, the lion is good and beautiful, and your horrible diseases? You lie in the sun, and it is beautiful. I was impressed by their optimism. But at 6 o'clock in the evening, this philosophy came to a sudden stop, and I was soon to discover. After sunset, another world took over, the dark world of Aik, who is everything evil, dangerous, and terrifying. The optimistic philosophy ends, and a philosophy of fear and ghosts and magic spells for averting the evil one begins. Then, at sunrise, the optimism starts off again without any trace of inner contradiction. And I thought that was interesting. I kind of dubbed it the 12-hour optimist. It kind of takes on superstition, and there's a function behind it. And if you look at what I've already discussed with you, so I guess that pessimism, that this tribe had used when the sun went down, pretty much, was a way to avert something bad that could happen, and to be prepared. And that's kind of the Boy Scout motto, is be prepared, and when you're living out in the bush and there are lions around, tough to be optimistic whenever one of your tribe members gets ripped apart. So what better way than to come up with these extravagant and elegant stories and metaphors for the evil one, for the things that could happen that go bump in the night, or whatever the case, or maybe go growl in the night, So it's a way to avert that anxiety, because you could bet, and this is an example I use a lot in my clinical practice with people that have like generalized anxiety disorder or high anxiety or panic attacks that they don't know why or where they're coming from. One of the examples that I use that helps people kind of understand how it can be debilitating in a way that, for them, it's unrecognizable and it comes up all at once and there's no reason. But what I say to them is, imagine yourself in this room and a lion, or I say tiger normally, walks into the room, and you've got all that stuff pumping and your heart's pounding and your cortisol levels spike, and you have the fight or flight or freeze reflex that happens. So that's what this tribe is trying to do, is trying to utilize that, the normal anxiety for them, not the pathological stuff that a lot of people go through who have panic attacks, and I don't mean to minimize that at all, but they surrounded these events or tragedies with metaphors to help people be prepared, so that they could live, so that they could survive at night. And as a survival mechanism, they came up with this god, this Aik. I don't even know what that means, and I don't know what language it is, but he sounds terrifying. And I thought that was a good example of, kind of what I said, like the 12-hour optimist. You can be optimistic all day when you can see, but when you're in the dark, that's kind of a metaphor for the unconscious too. You don't know what to expect. But being able to plan for that is a way to offset it and to make the unconscious conscious. And that's kind of what psychoanalysis espouses as the main tenet of the entire philosophy, is to make the unconscious conscious so that it won't rule your life, and you will call it fate, is what they would say. If you don't know about it, it will rule your life and you'll call it fate. So that's to kind of dig into that a little bit. I found that story interesting. I hope you did as well. Now, for the pessimist, the two shouldn't be confused with introversion and extroversion, because you can have a complete extroverted person be more on the pessimistic side. And so there's no correlation that I've found, and I could be wrong because it happens often, more than I'd like to admit, but I couldn't find any correlation between optimism and pessimism versus introversion and extroversion. That I've seen both sides have a mix of one or the other, and I don't see anywhere to where it leans to one direction or the other direction. The pessimist has more of a defiant will to power, that kind of surpasses the sureness of the optimist. The pessimist can also be over anxious and despondent. And I think it just kind of comes with the territory, that the more the person withdraws and hides in their self, the greater becomes the secret need to be recognized. So a lot of times the pessimist can be looked at, and I think one of the biggest negative impacts is the social impact of someone who is pessimistic. What's wrong with this guy? I don't want to hang around him. All he does is, but I think a lot of people don't recognize that maybe there's this internal kind of gears turning, that somebody's trying to figure a situation out. It might look negative, and it may look like they don't want to be bothered, or but I don't think that's what's going on at all. I think there's maybe a defiant conviction of maybe the person's unrecognized merits at times. Maybe imposter syndrome kind of comes to mind in there somewhere. Could be relative to some of this. But, the pessimistic person tends to be more sensitive to, like, the slightest, disapprobation, or always wearing the stricken air of one who's misunderstood and deprived of his, like, rightful due, or his rightful, like, what he deserves, or but I think somebody on the outside kind of sees somebody who's more pessimistic or situationally pessimistic. Maybe they walked into this person being in a situation like that, and thinks that the person nurses kind of a morbid kind of pride and maybe an insolent discontent. But that's the very last thing that the pessimistic person wants. They might be going through that because of maybe, like, an issue with recognition of something that they're really proud of, but they can't seem to find a good way or a good outlet. And the person ends up in this kind of environment that they're in, having to pay kind of a more dearly cost than someone who's completely optimistic and carefree and maybe even a little delusional. Definitely that looks better on the outside, but again, underneath, there's that secret fear. So there's this inverted kind of maybe the other side of the coin kind of thing, that instead of having that inverted kind of fear underneath, somebody from the outside sees this plain and simple, like an open book. If they were to be able to see underneath the optimist, they would see the exact same thing. It's just on the surface. For someone that's pessimistic, maybe they're a verbal processor. Maybe it's something that they've really been working at that's kind of got them bothered. And like I said, I think people with higher anxiety probably can be more pessimistic. Although I haven't seen any research, just my own kind of take on things. But I feel like pessimistic people can be very tough-minded, maybe a little sensationalistic, maybe a little, I don't know, I want to say like materialistic, or needing proof in some facile kind of tangible way that they can get their head or their hands wrapped around something. I think you see a lot of this with more, I want to say, atheistic type folks, because it's more externally, and it's more like almost kind of idealistic in a way, to where they're constantly wrapping their head around things, and they can't dig down into underneath, like somebody who has a lot of hope, who is maybe religious or whatever, and maybe they're spiritual, and it's easier to get to that place for them. But again, like, this is just my own kind of musings here, that I haven't seen the research on that specific stuff, although it makes sense to me. And I know William James got into some of that a long time ago, but his stuff is still relevant today. I want to say a lot of it is, or he would have been forgotten, in history. I do want to point out too that while doing this research, I did notice where cognitive behavioral therapy has what they have a list of cognitive distortions, they're called, or just errors in thought. And it did pick up a hint of catastrophizing. You might check that out. And also check out the cognitive distortion list, because I think it's important for people to see. There's actually a book called The Feeling Good Handbook by David Burns, I think is who it is. But anyway, what I've noticed with the pessimistic side of things is that this catastrophizing is just kind of a way to where you basically just blow things out of proportion and just make everything, basically a shit show, and I don't think that that's good for people, just like any of the errors in thought. So I think that we kind of have to keep reins on pessimism equally as much as we do with optimism. If you can get to where you're making everything a catastrophe versus the other side where you're blatantly delusional about everything, both are equally bad for you. So like I said, it's a way to maybe kind of on the continuum, find a way to be able to branch out. If you notice yourself, I would encourage you to think about the way that you see things, like even like I said in the restaurant, maybe back this recording up to what we talked about there for a little bit about the waitress. But think about that yourself. Think about where you're at on this continuum. I thought it was important because I run into a lot of people who are just overtly optimistic. And I have a good mix of people that I know who have been through a lot of stuff in their life. And that anxiety gets away from people sometimes. And I think that can tend, toward leaning toward like a Schopenhaueristic kind of, outlook on life. I think too, like, how would Schopenhauer have been if he was more optimistic? I think that it would have impacted his writing negatively. I think he wouldn't have stood out quite like he does if he would have cleaned things up a little bit. I think he, along with, and I know Freud was a fan of his too. A lot of those guys were, a lot of the psychoanalytic guys were, because he was just so profound in his thought process. But I know Freud was also, the older he got, he was just kind of sick of people, because he did see, the rise of Adolf Hitler and all that tragedy. Freud was Jewish, so he just saw where he lost kind of, I don't want to say lost touch with humanity, but he lost the good in humanity by seeing those and experiencing those things. And again, like he, just like Schopenhauer, if they would have been overtly optimistic, their writings would not have withstood the test of time like they have. So that's my take on things. This podcast was a little bit longer than usual. I try to keep them around 20, 25 minutes, somewhere around there. But I thought that this was more content driven than previous episodes, and I put a lot more thought into it, just because I was curious about it, and that's one of, in my intro on the Anchor app, you see in there that under the subtitle of what the podcast is about, one of the things is curiosity, and I think that that's one of the reasons I work in clinical and I work with people a lot. Is for me, I'm more of an investigator, I feel like, than I am a therapist or somebody that's trying to help. I'm innately and just fascinated by the mind. We are the most complex thing on this planet. And I think that's saying a lot. We're also, I think, one of the dumbest creatures on the planet at times too. But I'm curious, and it came out a little bit in this episode. I want to say I believe we're on iTunes now, because I was looking through my server. So we've got iTunes, so Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Breaker, Castbox, Pocket Cast, Podbean, Radio Public, and Stitcher. So, and of course we've got the Facebook page, and you can find us on Twitter. Email us at mindoutpodcast@gmail.com. Give me some suggestions. Maybe if there was any insight that you gained into anything that you listened to, I'd really like to hear about it. I'd like to be able to discuss some of your own findings on air, if it would be okay with you. I mean, I think it would be good conversation for us. And again, I hope you're having a good week. I hope next week treats you better. I want you to plan for maybe something that could set you back, with this podcast here. But check us out online. Let me know how you're doing. Send me an email. Send me a comment on Facebook or Twitter. I'd like to hear from you. Till next time, we will see you later.